I've traveled a bit across the African continent. It's my goal to visit every single African country by the year 2020. So I've done 32 countries as we speak. And the amazing thing in my travels across the continent is every nation I've gone to is very different from others. So I've never gone to a country in Africa where things look familiar. The languages may be similar, and but ultimately, each country has just a way of being and a way of doing. And God has also done something amazing in each country, that it has this compelling natural beauty. In Kenya, arriving at the Nairobi International Airport, you can't but help, notice this amazing game park right between the airport and the city. I think it's the only game park in the world situated right on the edge of the city like that. So you will have animals, and there in the backdrop, a background to that picture would be this amazing city. Or you can go to another part of Africa, like I have, and you go to Egypt, for example, and you see all these pyramids that are just unique structures. You don't really see them anywhere else except on this continent, at least in the way they're built. In fact, there are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, which is a conversation we can have another day in terms of who built them and so forth. But it's fascinating to be standing next to these colossal structures, and these were just done in paying homage to a king in that culture. Or you can come right down here in Southern Africa to the Victoria Falls at the borders of Zimbabwe and Zambia. I don't know who can claim the Victoria Falls, but there we are, an amazing place. I have a personal story to tell of a family who had a member who would not believe in God. They went to the Victoria Falls and one holiday, and the man was so overwhelmed by just this natural beauty at the falls, and he got saved with nobody really preaching the gospel to him, but him simply saying, if there's something so beautiful and so compelling, there has to be a God. Then the peoples of Africa themselves are just something to really enjoy. Again, very nice people. Malawi is probably as the friendliest people, in my view, at least in the countries I have visited. In some nations, people can be seemingly aggressive and you feel intimidated, and they're kind of in your face. In one airport, I arrived and 3 people were holding my name, and I didn't know which one to go with and who was the authentic. I had to retreat and go back on my phone, and I said, there are 3 people waiting for me. And they says, well, we're glad you called first, because some of them will take you for a ride and will never find you, type of thing. So you find cultures are very different. Some people aggressive, some people very conservative, some people don't even care about you. It's just different things. And then cultures have also things they celebrate. Here in the southern part of Africa, they have an event that will happen, that happens every year, called the Reed Dance, where young maidens come out and really celebrate their purity. And so you find in the KwaZulu nation, part of South Africa, they have this culture. The Swazis in Swaziland also have this reed dance that celebrates this culture. Now, point I really want to make is, regardless of all these cultures that we still find predominantly expressed in their unique ways across this continent, well, Christianity is now the most widely practiced religion in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that basically means that the center of Christianity with that has shifted from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. Some records tell us that over 10,000 people come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ every single day. And we have churches that are growing at a rapid rate. And some of the churches, some of the nations have gone to even the actual structure, the physical building itself is so humongous. Some people are now using not meters anymore, but kilometers to describe the size of their buildings. Now, one of those nations that is so many, a collection of these big churches, if you like, surprises me in the fact that while it really has this very pronounced presence of Christians, the nation has a reputation for being one of the most corrupt. So it makes me wonder, how can you have this paradox of nations, a continent where Christianity is now the widely practiced faith, but the reality on the ground, and some countries even having statistics as high as 80% Christian? Why is it that the presence of Christians is not translating into the betterment of lives for everyone around? Why is that? One of the books I read a couple of years ago by a lady called Landa Cope, she makes this compelling statement. She says Muslim evangelists in Africa ask, what does Christianity do for the people? The answer today is nothing. Nothing changes. The churches get bigger and bigger. More and more people get saved, but nothing changes. The people are still poor, diseased, uneducated, and left in political and economic chaos, she submits. Now, that's not a very pleasant reality to be dealing with. A picture where we are having the growth, the rapid growth of the church, people getting saved in their numbers, but nations are not really being transformed. We are not seeing the gains translating into something tangible where the very presence of believers in a given nation is not really changing the lives of the people within that nation. The same Landa Cope, whom I quoted, then says we are not seeing biblical values applied by Christians today, and therefore we do not see the influence those truths would have. Bottom line, she's actually saying, well, people accept the Lord, but they don't take on and internalize His truths, the teachings of His Word, and make them their own and who they are. So we have this gap between what we believe and how we live. And I want us to have a conversation about that, because we're really talking about confronting some of these enduring aspects of our cultures, how they can have a stronghold on us that make it almost impossible for us to be able to express ourselves in the way that we should. So I really want to make a submission, if you don't mind, that Africa is largely evangelized, but yet to be Christianized. We have accepted the gospel, I am not sure that we have made the gospel our way of life. When you meet a believer, someone who might say to you, I am a Christian, many times you are surprised when they finally reveal that they're Christian. Because some of their behavior leading up to this confession will be inconsistent with their claim. So I really want us to have a conversation about this. Why is it that we have this discrepancy where you can have Christians in the majority of the makeup of the constituency of any nation, but we are yet to really make the difference that we could in this context? So I'd like to follow up with the statement that the gospel is yet to penetrate into the deepest aspect of African culture, whereby it becomes a way of life. The gospel is yet to penetrate into the deepest aspects of the African culture, where it becomes the gospel a way of life. So we really want to talk about this aspect of the cultural strongholds. Now, cultural strongholds are those things that are really deep within the African culture that the gospel, if you like, has not really found a way of redressing. And then to come up with a statement, a strategy that says, then, how does God deal with cultural paradigm shifts? How does he take us from these things within our culture that hold us back to how we can truly overcome that? Now, to do that, there's a passage I've always read, and I'm sure you have many, many times, but never quite appreciated it in the way I am going to unfold it this time around. As Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. A very familiar passage which has these words. The Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I'll show you. Now, reading that statement makes you realize God is up to something, because he could simply have said to Abraham, I want you to go to the nation or to the country I'll show you. Same instruction, really. Why does God say, leave your country, your people, your father's household? Why does he enumerate these? Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I'll show you. And then he offers some motivation. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I'll curse. And look at the last part. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Wow. Men, when you come to a fuller appreciation of what God is saying in the instructions he is giving to Abraham, even if today the same instructions were given to me, I'll probably go running. Because, man, what a blessing God is promising you, particularly the last bit. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Wouldn't you want to be a channel of blessing that God would use to bless everyone, every nation on earth? I mean, that That is special. So what does God mean? Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's house, and go to the land I'll show you. Why didn't God just do what he wanted to do with Abraham wherever he was situated? Why did he need to take him out of his country, away from his people, and away from his father's house to a place where the Lord would show him? Why did God need to do that? Well, a closer reading of this passage will reveal amazing principles. Number one, the greatest impediment to transformation, is unwillingness to let go. A few years ago, a friend of mine told me a story that in some part of Cameroon, now please don't hold this story against me if it's not true, but he's the one who told me the story, and he was from Cameroon. He says one of the delicacies they enjoy in that part of the world is a special type of monkey. And this monkey, particularly the hand of the monkey, is what they really enjoy eating. Now, in order to capture this monkey, they'll put a jar with a narrow opening in the ground where it cannot be retrieved easily. And they will load into this jar with nuts and whatever crazy things monkeys love to eat. And these monkeys will come and grab everything, they negotiate their hand into this jar and they grab everything. But because they are not willing to let go, they actually get stuck because they are holding this handful of goodies, and it's too tight, or it's bigger for them to negotiate that tight space on this jar, and they get stuck. As a picture I get of the principle God is trying to communicate with Abraham, unless you leave your country, unless you leave your people, unless you leave your father's house, if you are unwilling to let go, you will never experience what I'm about to show you. Wow, what a principle. So I want to start our conversation right there, because the instruction to leave in the New King James Version is even more blunt. He says, get out. So the instruction to leave is an imperative implying something you don't have a choice about. So an imperative is a command. So God is not negotiating with Abraham. He's not saying to him, hey, dude, think about it. If you like it, I'd like you to think about, going to this new place that I'm about to show you. Besides, who just goes to a place they don't know what it is about? So God is not really giving Abraham an option here. He's telling him, get out. Go to the land I will show you. At the back of my mind, when I think about this instruction, I don't know what Abraham said to his wife on that day, having this conversation. Love, we need to move on. And she says, where are we going? I don't know. Imagine, the real life situation of him trying to have this conversation and says, we need to go. Okay, sure, I'm willing to go. Where are we going? No idea. Kind of gives you the impression that, God was not even giving Abraham the opportunity to kind of work it out and decide, okay, give me a few days to think about this. God is simply saying, get out, and for a good reason. So that concept then of leaving represents a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift from the familiar to the revolutionary, without which things would have remained the way they are. So, bottom line, God is really asking Abraham to leave his country, his people, his family, because if he had stayed where he was, things would have simply carried on the way they were. Why? It was familiar, it was comfortable, it was what we today we call a comfort zone. It was things the way he was used to. And God is about to use this man for greater divine purposes, to be a blessing to all nations of the earth. That's why I described it as a revolutionary experience. Because I mean, Abraham was just an ordinary guy, just like everybody else around him. And God says, leave all of that. It kind of reminds me of another passage in the Bible where God asks us to do the same. He says, therefore man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. You know, although that passage uses a different word, a Hebrew word, the principle is really the same. So what comes to my mind is simply this: unless a man is prepared to leave, he is not going to have a good marriage. Think about it. There's some couples who are actually married but have not really left their parents. Anything happens, they run back home to their parents. You even have conversations with couples. So, where are you going for holiday? We're going home. So, what do you call where you live? What is that? So, you can see that psychologically and emotionally, and sometimes even financially, some couples have not moved on. And their homes are being remotely controlled by the home they're failing to leave. That was just a little tangent to underscore the importance of the paradigm here, where God is really saying to Abraham, leave your people, leave your family. Because really, without that aspect of leaving, then God could not really see Abraham going to the next aspect of this revolutionary experience. Another passage that may come to mind is Luke 9, verse 23. If you remember, Jesus is inviting his disciples. He has done a bit of teaching. People are following him around, and some for the wrong reasons. And he kind of wants to clarify who really should be his follower. And he used very, very strict words. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself. Whoa. Take up his cross daily and follow me. My paraphrase of that is Jesus is really asking those who want to follow him to forget what they actually know. Prepare themselves sacrificially for following him according to what he requires and demands. That's what taking up your cross would be about. And then follow me and do whatever I say. Now, that's not a comfortable invitation. It really demands that you let go of what you might know and what might be the familiar and so forth. Let me maybe make one more passage as to illustrate the point here and the principle we're trying to drive home. Romans 12, verse 2. And it has those words, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Now, what grabs me already from reading that line is our world has a pattern, has already an entrenched way of doing and thinking, and is saying, don't be caught up in that. And what's the alternative? But be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. Let me go ahead of myself and say, don't you think that when God is saying to Abraham, leave your country, leave your people, and leave your family, that God is saying you've been caught up in the way that your country, your people, your family thinks. And if you want to work with me, and if I'm going to use you in the way I want to, you need to let go of all that. Oh. We need to process that. God calling Abraham and saying to him, leave. Why is this an important thought to process? Well, the second principle I draw from this passage is this: personal transformation is mostly impeded by everything that defines you. Your country, your people, your family. Personal transformation is mostly impeded by everything that defines you. That's why God is saying to Abraham, leave your country, leave your people, leave your family. Well, let us look at those three a little bit more closely for our purposes here. Now, your country, in this context, would have referred to Haran in Mesopotamia, where Abraham had been brought by his father. Remember, they were from Ur of the Chaldeans, and then they started moving to Canaan, but somehow they stopped in Haran, where Abraham's father eventually died. But the plan was to go all the way to Canaan. We are not given the reason behind the migration. So it was on that route that God then has this conversation with Abraham and say, now leave your country, leave your people, and leave your father's household and go to the land I'll show you. My kind of perception here in reading what God is saying is that the concept of country here goes beyond geographical location to connote a worldview or way of life. Think about it. If Abraham had stayed in his country, he would have simply behaved in the ways that his country prescribes. Now, I mentioned in my travels on different parts of the world, I have noticed that I can almost tell today a nationality by the way a person behaves. For example, I have some friends from West Africa, and West Africans have a peculiar way of behaving and expressing themselves or presenting themselves in a given situation. You can tell that person is from that part of the world. Now, people from this part of the world, which is Southern Africa, also have a different way of presenting themselves. In my estimation, a little bit more conservative. I find West Africans, and please, this is my generalization, some West Africans can be a little aggressive, and some Southern Africans are a little bit conservative. And please, I'm just generalizing, just to illustrate the point that you will find that your country prescribes a certain way that you behave. Now, we have already had a conversation around culture and the totality of culture as a way of life. That's almost what I am intimating here. And God is saying to Abraham, leave that. Leave your country, leave your people, and go to the land that I will show you. And you'll see that Abraham came a long way. It's not just a short distance we're talking about here. As a distance that would take months of traveling to go to where God had in mind in terms of where he was taking him. Now, in my own research, just coincidentally, I've discovered a very peculiar um, catalyst of people who usually change nations. If you think of some of our so-called liberation heroes, most of them left their countries, went elsewhere either to be educated or trained, and then came back as agencies of change. It's interesting. I've also discovered that some people, as long as they remain in the same culture or country that raised them, they just do what everybody else does. But you see a bit of transformation when this person is taken out of their country to a different country. When they come back, they come completely different. I lived out of my country and still continue to live out of my country as we speak. But the first time I went back home after a lengthy period of not being in my country, almost 11 years, my mother looked at me and says, "You are different." Interesting. First thing she said, "You are different." In other words, she's saying, I've changed. What changed me? Where I went. So I came back with a different take from who I used to be. Don't you think God is up to something here and saying to Abraham, leave your country and go to the land I will show you? But not just that. God also said to Abraham, leave your people. Now the word your people translates to that English word kindred. These are your descendants, your close relatives or relationship by blood or marriage, implying really, really close people that you are associated with. So these are really your extended family, but really close members of that extended family, if you like. Interesting. These are people you will probably spend the rest of your life visiting and being with and so forth. And God says to Abraham, leave them too. So what is God really up to? He could have simply said, go to the country or the land, I'll show you. But why does he say, leave your people? I want to suggest to you that your people from whom Abraham has to be separated, people from whom he learnt norms for everyday aspects of life through customs, values, and attitudes, and rituals, and roles, a worldview into which he was indigenized. Those are the very people God is saying, I want you to come out of. Why is that? Well, when you read further into the story of Abraham, every time he got into trouble, it was because of his people. Remember, God has said to him, leave your people. Well, he doesn't quite follow that instruction. He takes his nephew called Lot. And him and Lot are prospering and doing well, but they no longer have enough land to support the herds of animals that Lot had and Abraham had. And so their shepherds are now fighting, and so they have to go their separate way. So Lot could almost have derailed Abraham in whatever God had in store for him. Another story that comes to mind, you remember in the narrative, God promises Abraham a child, and Abraham is getting on. He's about 75 when the story starts, and it's getting late. 25 years later on, he's about 100, and God hasn't quite delivered on the promise. He just says, oh, you're going to have a son. His wife thinks time is running out, so she decides to give him her maid servant so that he could have a child through the maid servant. Now, what's interesting is we don't really have an instruction before that in the Bible where God says, oh, by the way, if you can't have children, you can have them through your servants. It's a wife who decides, okay, she wants a child, and therefore the best way to do it, let's have the servant give you a child through that. Interesting. And this is not what God has promised, but it's a family member imposing what may have been a culturally acceptable practice of the day to now go ahead and have a child through that practice. And as you know, I don't need to tell you, if you follow, then the child who is born through the servant, who is Ishmael, to date, we are still paying for what that decision was about. Abraham was asked to leave his people. And every time he was in trouble, it was because of his people. He didn't fully follow the instruction that the Lord had given him. So he was paying for some of that mistake. But not just his people. The Lord also says, leave your father's household. Leave your father's household. Now, a father is the originator of a family with a specific dwelling under whose paternity everything is determined. Now, I make the statement almost intentionally because studies are emerging now over and over again emphasizing the importance of a fatherly figure in any family. Now, whether you had a father or not, a fatherly figure present or absent has implications on how your life has turned out to be. Fathers have a real and pronounced influence on your life. They determine most of what you are, even the name that you carry. That's because of your father. That's why God is saying to Abraham, you need to come out of that. Why? Your life, your family provides the compass through which life is navigated, or the lens through which experiences are processed. That's a little bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Your family provides the compass through which life is navigated. A lot of what you are through those early childhood and familial experiences that brought you into where you are, or the way you feel, the way you think, the way you sometimes behave. It's because of the family that raised you. And some of those experiences that you went through in your childhood, that some you're still processing, and others you haven't quite processed, but they kind of catch up with you at one point or another. That's the experience of being raised in a particular family. So this really leads me to make the point where God is saying, leave your country, leave your people, and leave your family. When you look at that whole aspect of country, people, and family, you start realizing, oh, these really are three influences in your life that really shape who you are. So your country, your people, and your family are influences that has shaped who you are. So you have a paradigm that is based on the country you're from, the people that you are associated with, and the family that raised you. I think that's the point the Lord is really making in this passage. Because if he simply wanted Abraham to move on, he would just say, okay, go to this country that I'm going to show you. Why is he really emphasizing country, people, family? Because those three really have a profound influence on who you are, they shape that word again, your worldview. Your worldview. Why is that important for us to process today? Or simply this. Jerry Ireland says that worldviews are seldom eradicated, but instead are often applied over other systems that try to offer a different way of viewing reality. Please hear that observation. Worldviews are seldom eradicated, but instead are often applied over other systems that try to offer a different way of viewing. So let me illustrate it this way. When you become a Christian, you may need an adjectival qualifier that says, I am an African Christian. By that statement, you are saying Africa qualifies, in some measure, your Christianity. In other words, whatever Africa has done and brought into your frame of reference, you can't quite deny, because there's a worldview that has been imposed on you because of where you come from. And it applies to any other culture for that matter. They are latent within where you come from, the people you're associated with, as well as the family that raised you, influences that has shaped simply the way you look at things. So when God is instructing Abraham and saying, leave your country, it's not just a physical journey, I think, that God has in mind. It's a paradigm shift. Is to let go of anything from those influences that might have stopped him from seeing God and working with God and walking with God the way he should have. Leave your country. Leave your people. And leave your family. It's interesting, a couple of years ago, I came across this statement that really fascinated me. Apparently, it's an African proverb that says, you can take a man out of the village, but you cannot take the village out of the man. Very interesting statement, isn't it? Saying, you can move a person on, but really, who they truly are may not change with that movement. So there is a much deeper message here that God really implies. Traditions run much deeper, because that's a paradigm, a way of seeing, a way of viewing that is strongly entrenched. And in Abraham's case, God was saying, it's time to let go. Let me jump across the pages of our Bible and bring a passage in Mark chapter 7, verses 5 through 9 and 13, to kind of bring home the point I'm trying to illustrate. So it reads, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? So there was a tradition, a cultural practice here, where if you were to eat, you had to wash your hands ceremonially to now eat in this culture. Now, again, it's not necessarily a divine instruction to do that. This was now a cultural practice. So Jesus comes with his disciples who are not really observing this ritual. It offends the Pharisees, whom you know were very strict. I want you to note Jesus' response to this. He says, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. Please hear that. Their teachings are rules taught by men. Is it possible that some things we insist upon are simply rules taught by men? Some of the things we actually practice and may even have Christianized, like they did in this very passage. The Pharisees are religious people, and very, very religious, very devout for that matter. And they're insisting on a tradition that they hold on to as dear, and Jesus is challenging that very tradition and simply saying, in modern day language, is that biblical? Is that a requirement by God? Or what is Jesus really challenging them to is to say, is it not your people from whom you have these traditions that are influencing what you are insisting upon? Why? These are rules taught by men. Isn't he challenging them to a paradigm shift in the same way that God had challenged Abraham? Verse 8 of that passage, Mark chapter 7, says, You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. Remember our first point? The greatest impediment to transformation is unwillingness to let go. And he said to them, You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your traditions. He's saying to them, you've fine-tuned, you've polished this act of being able to sidetrack the Word of God and impose your traditions, and making your traditions almost of greater significance than the Word of God. My goodness. Are we not guilty of the same? Where you find there are traditions, there are things that we have simply transported with us into our faith that we are not really asking and saying, why do we do what we do? We simply just do them. Here's Jesus challenging the disciples alongside the Pharisees to a different way of thinking. A few years ago, I had to do a funeral. You know, funerals are something we need to talk about because, again, I think I've already mentioned that a lot of our cultures simply refer to our way of life, the ways of any given group, and this is what distinguishes us one from the other. So they're simply rules of men being passed down from one generation to the next at best. So they're really what they are. So I was doing this funeral, and we get to that solemn moment when the coffin is about to be lowered. And just as the lowering begins, someone says, please wait. Now, that stunned me. Usually you don't have anybody. But apparently there was a fight that had ensued leading to this moment. And the fight got so bad because suddenly somebody had arrived who was claiming to be the son of the deceased, and he wanted to be recognized before this man could be buried. Now, I was asking myself, why would anybody wait until this point to make this claim? Why didn't he make himself known or to be introduced properly when he had all the time in the world? Well, there's a lot more in the culture that's happening and informing this moment that I want us to talk about in our next conversation. But the point I want to make is this. There's a lot within our cultures, a lot within the nation that raised us, or even the people that we are part of, and as much as in the family that raised us, that we may really need to go back to and ask, are there things from there, my country, my people, my family, that demand a paradigm shift from which I need to be rescued in order, like Abraham, to make my great trek into where God is taking me and really have an open mind? Because how does God justify Abraham? He believed. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. In other words, Abraham did not question what God was up to from what his people, from what his country, or from what his family would have imposed on him. Say, where do you think you're going? Or what do you think you're trying to do? Abraham left all that, if you like, progressively so, and got to a point where he simply trusted God. I want us to have a much deeper conversation here and truly ask, are there things that stand in our way from how we were raised that perhaps we haven't let go but are really obstacling us from seeing God at work? Because the third principle that I want us to see, and I'll end with this, and I'm not going to illustrate it any further, is just to make the point that overcoming cultural strongholds resides in unconditional acceptance of God's leading you to a new way of life. Overcoming cultural strongholds resides in unconditional acceptance of God's leading you to a new way of life. If you think about it, God says, go to the land I will show you. It sounds like a very simple and straightforward statement, but if you process it in a much deeper way, go to the land I'll show you stands in direct contrast to your country, to your people, your father's house, to signify a new way of life, a new beginning, a place where God is imposing a new paradigm on Abraham and saying, if you want to work with me, this has to be behind you. But the word show is a very interesting little word. In its simplest form, it means to look or to view. But in its much deeper sense, it suggests the use of perception to view objects and make judgments based on perspective. Oh my goodness. So it goes beyond just looking at something to the use of perception to view objects and to make judgments based on perspective. So it's when you have an appreciation of what you are processing that you now make judgments. That's what he's saying. So God is saying, I'm going to show you something. Now, the moment your true eyes are really open, you are going to appreciate what I'm going to do in and through you. What an opportunity. What an opportunity. You know, if you read that great chapter of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, it is a little anecdote on Abraham, verses 8 to 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Are you waiting for a similar promise with God, where God himself is saying, I'm going to take you to a place. I'm going to take you to a new beginning. I'm going to start something unique. I'd like to suggest to you today that our Christian faith is really about that. And I know the promised land has been used spiritually to represent where God is taking us. But truly, that promised land could begin right here and right now, where we simply shift our paradigms from things that hold us back, letting go of them and letting God. God bless you.